The Polygon network is a blockchain technology that's rising up really fast in the crypto world. So today we're going to be sending MATIC, which is Polygon's cryptocurrency, in a NodeJS web application so that you can make transactions in the web application sending MATIC. So what are we going to do in today's video? Well, first of all, I'll introduce to you guys what MATIC and the Polygon network actually is, and then I'll show you guys the architecture of today's application. Then we'll get straight into the demo, in which first of all we'll make the app, then we'll actually make the transactions sending MATIC between accounts, and then if we have time we might log the transactions in MySQL. Alright, so first of all, what is MATIC or Polygon? So it's basically a really cool technology that makes Ethereum even better. So it helps the Ethereum mainnet handle lots and lots of transactions really fast. This means that it's a layer 2 scaling solution because it has multiple layers. So like I said earlier, it's much faster than regular Ethereum's and it can handle more transactions, meaning that it improves the scalability a lot more. This means that you can do things very quickly and it also reduces the fees, or the gas price. Polygon is kind of like a special layer on top of Ethereum that makes everything work smoother and faster. It also has a seamless integration with Ethereum because it's built on top of it. And finally, it even has its own cryptocurrency, which is called MATIC, and that's the cryptocurrency that we're going to be exchanging in our web application today. So now let's check out the architecture of today's project. So NodeJS is a very popular programming language in which you can make web applications, kind of like React.js, which I've used before. Although now it can connect to a separate index.html file. So here we're going to code our web application in Node.js, and that's going to be shown to the user here. And then the Node.js web application is going to use the Web3.js library, and this is just a library built on top of Node.js so that we can work with MetaMask, MATIC, things like that. Now the Web3.js library, it's going to connect to the Polygon network and MetaMask so that we can make transactions from the user to the application, and then it'll send money to whoever we want to. And then later on, as an extension of this project, we might even be able to log all of these transactions in a MySQL database. So yeah, now that you guys know about the project, we can actually get into the demo to actually make this project. Alright, so first of all, I'm going to go to my editing software, which is Visual Studio Code, and here I have two files. I have my app.js file, which is going to be our file which we're going to code our web application in, and then we have the index.html, which will hold the actual UI elements of our web application. So inside of the index.html, I've just written some very basic code. All this will do is it'll print out as a title on the page, MATIC transfer. But we actually want to add a form element so that you can enter in, like, for example, whoever you're going to send the money to, and then maybe like a submit button. And then inside of the app.js, this is going to be like the backend. Here we're going to actually handle the transactions and the amount of money we're sending, things like that. So let's actually do that first. And just like any code, we're going to have to import our required libraries. In this case, I'm going to import 4 main libraries. So the first one, I'm going to add it as a variable here. So I'm going to say const express. And as you can see, I'm coding this in Node.js, so it's going to have a little bit of a different syntax. So here to create a variable or to import a library, you're going to have to initialize it using const, and then the variable name, and then equals to, and then here we have to say require because we want to require the library into our code. And then here we can add the library. In this case, the library is called express. And then after any command you're going to use in the code, you have to have a semicolon. And then same thing for all the other required libraries. So here, this Web3 library, this is going to allow us to interact with any sort of MetaMask functions, handling transactions, anything related to Web3. Now this FS library, which stands for file service, this is going to allow us to read other files in our same folder structure. We're going to use this library in order to read the index.html and display that as our web application. And now finally, this MySQL library, we're going to use this to document all the transactions that we carry out inside of the web application. Alright, now the first thing we need to do in our web application is actually set up the express.js library, which is what we imported up here. This will allow us to actually create our web application and host it on a local host on a certain port. So here I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to initialize it as app, and then I'm going to use the express function, which will initialize an actual app for us. And then finally, next I'm going to initialize the port, which is whatever localhost port we want to use. In this case, I'm going to host it on port 3000, which is just any common port, but you can host it on any port you want. And then next up, I'm going to read the index.html file using the file service library. Now, by reading the index.html file, our app.js, which is our backend, it's going to know that we need to show these elements, which are on the index.html, onto our web application. So let me initialize it as maybe index.html, and then I'm going to initialize it as file service dot, and then I'm going to use a function called readFileSync. This will read any index.html file. This will read any HTML file as whatever format we want it to. In this case, the format is UTF-8. Okay, and then a semicolon. And then now it's read this file and it's initialized it as a variable, but now I want to serve that index.html as the home page of our web application. So to do that, I'm going to say app, which is our web application, .get, and then here I'm going to make a route for our app. So any sort of website or web application is going to have routes. So let's take an example of any website. Let's say youtube.com. youtube.com. So here's the main URL, and this is going to be the default route, because even if you add a slash behind it, it'll just take you to the default page. But then if I say youtube.com/ maybe my channel, maybe let's say youtube.com/Rishabh, then that's going to be another route. But for now, let's just initialize the index.html as the main default route, so that whenever you go to our localhost server, it'll just open up the index.html. So here I'm going to say inside of the default route, which is just slash, here we're going to add requests and res. So we're going to say rec res, and then here I'm going to add it into curly braces so that we can say whenever the user goes into the default route, it should do this. Now I want to say response.send, and then we want to send, not set encoding, send. Now we want to send a response to the user. In this case, that response is going to be the index.html file. So now whenever the user goes to the default route, it should send them to the index.html. And finally, the last thing we have to do before running the server is actually start the server in our code. So let's say app.listen. This is a function that will start listening for a port, in this case that 3000 port, and maybe let's just add like a successful, let's just log if it's successful or not so that we know if there's any errors. So I'm going to say port, comma, and then here I'm going to add the curly braces so that whenever it's listening on the port, maybe let's say console.log. This is kind of like a print function for those of you that know Python. So console.log, that will just print it out on the terminal, whatever we want it to. And I'm going to say maybe server successfully running on, and then I'm just going to add the link. So http://localhost. And then let's actually dynamically add the port, because although I know it's port 3000, just for fun, let's dynamically add the port. So now it's taking this port from the port variable here, so if I were to decide to change it, I don't have to change it everywhere else. And now it'll dynamically get it from the variable and print out that it's running on this port. So let's save this and actually run it. Now what it should do is if we open up the localhost 3000 port, then it should take us to our web application and show us the index.html, which for now just has the h1 tag of MATIC transfer. So it should just show us that as the header. So let's actually test this out. Alright, so in terminal, first of all, before I do anything else, for those of you that are using NodeJS for the first time, you're going to have to install NodeJS and all the packages associated with it. But since I've already done that, let me just install all the packages that we have for our code. So to do that, first of all, I'm going to say npm install, and then all of our packages. In this case, we have Express Web3, FS, and MySQL 2. So let's hit enter, and it should node install all of these packages. Alright, so as you can see, it's successfully added all of our packages. So let me just type out clear here, and now we can actually run it. So to run a web application in Node, all you have to do is say node and then whatever the file name is. In this case, my file name is called app.js. So I'm going to say node app.js and hit enter. And okay, it's saying rec is not defined, so request is not defined. I believe that just is something with the syntax. Okay, yeah, I can see it now. So I needed to end this here so that we're declaring the value of request and response, and then here we're using it. That's why, because I didn't fully end the parentheses. So let's just save that and hit clear and then run that again. And then yeah, it's saying server successfully running on, and then we have the URL. So let me actually copy this URL, go to Google Chrome and open it up. And yeah, there we go. So as you can see, it's running our web application. Now, obviously this is just a very simple static page that's saying MATIC transfer, but the importance of this is that it's taking it from the HTML page. So now if we add anything in the HTML, like for example the form, then it'll add that as well. Let's actually add the form right now so that we know what it's going to do. So just like I talked about in the architecture, the user is going to have to enter the recipient account address, or whoever they want to send the money to, and then it'll transfer that MATIC to that account. So now I'm going to add a form here. So I'm going to use a form tag, and then the action we're going to add the action later. But now inside of this form, let me add a label and an input. So a label will just add some text above, like for example a text box, and here I'm going to say for maybe recipient address, and then here the actual label is recipient, or maybe let's just add like who do you want to send money to. Okay, and then next we're going to add an input tag, and then this is going to be text. Maybe let's also add an ID also. Let's say recipient address, and then name we're going to add as recipient address. And then we're going to make this required because obviously we need the user to enter this in, otherwise it's not going to work. And then finally, let's just add a submit button. So I'm going to say input type is submit, and then let's add some text onto the submit button. Let's say value is maybe send MATIC to this account, or maybe let's just say send MATIC. That'll sound simpler. And then actually, just so it looks a little bit nicer, let me just add some BR tags, just so it adds some line space. And then yeah, now we have a successful form. So let's actually test this out by rerunning our Node app. And then if I reload this page, then yeah, it shows us this form here. So it's asking who do you want to send money to, and then we can input some account addresses. And then once we press send MATIC, it should send the MATIC through MetaMask. So let's actually, right now this is just a static page. If I enter in values and press send, nothing's gonna happen. All it does is here it shows in the URL. But first of all, instead of showing in the URL, we wanted to actually do something with that value. So what we can do is inside of this form action, whenever you press the submit button, in the backstage of this index.html, which is the app.js, we can tell it to do something by initializing a function. In that function, we want to send from a root account, we want to send some money to the recipient account. So let's do that. But before we do all of that, we have to actually set up the Web3 provider for the Polygon network. And like I said, I'm not going to do this on the Ethereum mainnet because I've already done that video. But instead, for this video, I'm going to do it on the Polygon network sending MATIC. So here, let me just make a variable called provider URL. And then here we're going to need a provider URL or an RPC URL for Polygon. And Polygon has an official RPC URL. Here it's called polygonrpc.com. And as you can see, there's a bunch of information on how people have used the RPC in like the last 24 hours. But right now I'm just going to copy the endpoint link and I'm going to put it in here. This will tell our code that we're going to be using the Polygon network. Then I can make a Web3 variable. And this Web3 variable is going to allow us to work with all of our MetaMask, all of the Web3 functions, such as making transactions, things like that. So I'm going to say new Web3, because that's the function that we've imported. And then I'm going to say new web3.providers.http provider. And what this will do is it'll just set up the Web3 provider for the Polygon URL. And then here we'd need to pass in the Polygon URL. So I'm going to say provider URL, which is the function, which is the variable we just initialized. And then we're going to need semicolons on all of these. Okay. And then next up, what we're going to do is we need to actually make the function so that we can send the MATIC to the recipient account. So I'm going to make an async function, and then we're going to call this send MATIC and log, because that's another thing we need to do later on. But for now, let's just focus on sending the MATIC. And then here we're going to need one parameter, which is the recipient account address. And we're going to get that from this MATIC transfer from the web application. So the user is going to enter in the recipient account address, and then from that, we're going to send money to that address. So recipient account address, and then here inside of that, we can just say try and then inside of that, we're going to use a try and catch. We're going to use a try and catch so that it'll handle any errors gracefully. So let's say try catch, and then here inside of the try, first of all, we're going to set up all of the things we need for making a transaction and then actually make the transaction. So I'm going to, first of all, we need to convert the MATIC that we want to send. In this case, I'm going to send a very small amount because I don't want to waste too much money on gas fees and stuff. So we need to first of all convert the amount of MATIC we want to send into Wei. And Wei is basically like a really, really small denomination of Ether. So here, first of all, let me say const amount in MATIC, and then that's the amount we want to send to the recipient. So I'm just going to say maybe like 0.01 MATIC. Obviously, that's not that much money, and in real use cases, you're going to be using a bunch more. But just for the sake of this video, I'm going to make it a small amount of money. And then here now we want to convert that to Wei. So here we're going to say web3, we're going to use one of the functions, web3.utils.toWei. And this function will convert Ether to Wei. And then here we're going to say amount in MATIC, and then .toString, because we need to convert it to a string. That's what the function uses. And then we want to do that from Ether. Okay, then next up, what we're going to do is connect our account, our MetaMask account, to this web application. And then from there, we can send the money. So here I'm going to say const, and then let's make a variable, let's call it like root account, because that's the account we're sending the money from. And then we're going to say web3.eth.accounts, and then this is how you can identify an account. And then here I'm going to use a function called private key to account. So since I don't want to sign the transaction from the web application, I just want to do it from the code, I'm going to use a function called private key to account. And then now here inside of this function, I would need to provide the private key of my root account. And now you shouldn't share this private key with anyone. So instead of writing it out here, I'm going to put it into a config file in a different file and then import it into this code. but I'll do that later. For now, I'm just gonna like enter a random string. I'll just say like private key here, and then I'll enter it in later. So obviously your private key is very important for your MetaMask account. With that, people can basically get all of your funds. So then the next thing I want to do is add that to my Web3 wallet so that we've connected it to our web application. So I'm going to say web3.eth.accounts.wallet. This is basically like my wallet inside of the code. So I'm going to say .add. So now I want to add this to the Web3 wallet, and I want to add this root account variable that I just created. Then next I want to make that into the default account. So I'm going to say web3.eth.defaultaccount equals, and then we're going to make that the root account.address. So now what I've done is, first of all, I've made this root account here. This is going to be the account we're sending the money from using our private key. Then I'm going to add that into my Web3 variable, and then we're going to make that into the default account. Then we can actually make an official transaction. The transaction is going to be from the root account to this recipient account, which the user is going to enter. So now I'm going to make a function or a variable called transaction object, and then this variable is going to allow me to actually send the money. And we're going to add all of the parameters you need in Ethereum. And we're going to add all the parameters into this variable. So I'm going to say from is root account dot address, because we need just the address. Then to is going to be the recipient account address. That's going to be the parameter. And then the value, since it takes the value in way, we're going to make that this amount in way variable. And then finally the gas, this is kind of like sales tax on a store. And then the gas fees is for any transaction, you're going to need to calculate a certain amount of gas fee that's needed in order to complete the transaction. It's kind of like in a store when you're buying goods, it's kind of like in a store when you're buying goods, there's sales tax. It's kind of like that, except for cryptocurrencies. So for the gas fee, I'm going to add a standard gas limit of 21,000. And then this is just the standard gas fee for a very simple transaction. Although it's better to dynamically calculate the gas fee in your code so that you're not spending too much or too little. But for the sake of this video, I'm not spending that much because it's 0.001 MATIC. Then the last thing we need to do is sign and send the transaction so that it actually sends the money. So then next, I'm going to make a variable called signed transaction. And then this signed transaction, I'm going to say await, and then this is going to allow the Web3 library to actually sign the transaction. So I'm going to say web3.eth.accounts. And then here we're going to use a function called sign transaction. Sign transaction. And then here we need two parameters. First one is all the parameters you need in the transaction, which include the from, to, value, and gas, but I've already included that in this variable here. So I'm going to say transaction object, and then again you need your private key for your root account. So I'm just going to copy this and I'll add it later again. So I'm going to put the private key. For you guys, you would actually have to enter the actual private key. And then finally, we need the transaction receipt, just so that we can get the output of the raw transaction and send it. So I'm going to make another variable called transaction receipt. I always struggle on spelling receipt. Okay, and then await web3. Same thing, web3.eth. And then here now we can say send signed transaction. Signed transaction. And then that's going to be the function to actually send the receipt for it. And then here we're going to say signed transaction, which is the variable, .raw transaction. So that's just an attribute of the signed transaction. Alright, so now after we've done all this, I forgot a parentheses. Okay, after we've done all this, then it's going to sign and actually send all the money. And then finally, just to make sure it's all working, I'm going to maybe say, I'm just going to like print it on the terminal screen. I'm going to say console.log, maybe like transaction was successful And then just in case it doesn't work, and then after that, I'm just gonna send like the receipt so that we can see everything that happened. Okay, and then we'll show the transaction receipt and then semicolon, yeah. All right, there we go. All right, now finally, the last thing we need to do is, just so that we can handle any errors that might pop up, we're gonna say catch, just in case there is any error. Then we want to console.log that, just so that we can see any error that comes up. So I'm gonna say console.error, and then maybe like error sending the transaction, and then we can actually show the error. All right, there we go. So now the last thing we need to do, we've done all of the things for sending the money now, but we've put it into this function send, MATIC, and log. So now we need to actually call that function whenever the user enters something inside of this form, inside of the HTML file. So here, let me add let's just say the index.html, the form action, instead of just keeping it static, we're gonna make it so that this will go to a certain route, and then whenever that route is called, then in the app.js, it's going to call this function, because then we know that the user entered something in the form. So here, to make another route, I'm going to say app.post, and then we'll add the route. In this case, let's call it like /send MATIC. That's a good route name. And then we're going to say express is URL encoded, and then we're going to say we don't want it to be extended, so we'll say extended is false. And then after that, again, we need to initialize the request and response. So I'm going to say res, and then put all of that in curly braces. So now whenever they go to the send MATIC, now we want to do two things. First of all, we need to get the recipient account address, which is whatever the user enters as their recipient address, and then use that for the send MATIC and log function. So here I'm going to make a variable called recipient account address, and then that's going to be our request, which is whatever the user enters, body dot recipient address. And this recipient address is actually the ID of whatever the input is here. So here you can see the ID is recipient address. That's how we're getting this here. So we're going to get the value of whatever the user enters, and then use that whenever we're calling our function send MATIC and log, and then as the parameter we can say recipient account address, so that it knows what account to send it to. Alright, now finally the last thing we need to do is in our index.html, we just need to tell it to go to that /send MATIC route. So here I'm going to say form action is /send MATIC, so that it'll go to the route and actually send the money. And then the method, let's make it equal to post. Oh, this should be inside the quotation marks. All right, there we go. So now whenever we enter this form in Chrome, whenever we enter this form with our account address, then when we press the send MATIC, then it should go to the send MATIC route, and then that will take it to send the transaction to whoever we want to send the money to. So let's test this out. Okay, so I'm going to go to terminal here, stop it, and then hit clear, and then run it again. And then it's saying server successfully running. So now it should send 0.01 Ethereum, or MATIC, sorry, to whoever we want to send it to. So now I'm intending to send money from this account, which is called account 2, and this account has 21 MATIC. I'm intending to send it to account 1, which only has 0.01 MATIC. Oh, my bad, I clicked something. Okay, so now I want to copy the account 1's address so that we can send money to that account. And then it should go from 0.01 MATIC to 0.02. And then if we hit send MATIC, then it should take a couple seconds, but in terminal we should be able to see the receipt if it actually worked or not. And okay, it's doing something. Oh, error sending the transaction, private key here is not defined. Okay, I believe I changed it, but okay. Yeah, I did change it off camera, but I didn't save it. My bad. So let's just rerun this. Alright, so then we can do the same thing. Let me take off the send MATIC. And then again, I'm going to send it to, let me just copy it again just in case. I'm going to send it to my account 1 and then press send MATIC. And then let's go back to terminal so that we can see. It should show all of the receipt once it's done. Yeah, okay, so this is green, meaning it's probably working. And then let me go up here. And yeah, okay, it's saying transaction was successful. So let's go back to Chrome and then we can check on our account 1 here. And yeah, as you can see, it went from 0.01 to 0.02, meaning that it definitely did work. And if we can see activity, and you can see it says receive 0.01 MATIC on May 28th, that's right now. So yeah, there we go. We've successfully made an application that will send MATIC on the Polygon chain from one account to the other, all using our web application. And no matter what account we want to send it to, it'll send money to that account based on what we add in the web application. And it'll always send however much we want it to send. Here, if we want the amount in MATIC, we can change that from 0.01 to maybe like 1 MATIC, and it'll send that too. So yeah, there we go. We've made a successful application to transact MATIC on the Polygon chain. So yeah, that was working with the Polygon network and sending MATIC through a Node.js web application. Now, I'm really liking making these crypto videos, so if you're enjoying these crypto series, stay tuned for more. Thanks very much for watching. If y'all had any doubts, please comment down below. I'd love to help you out if you're stuck with any Node.js and Polygon questions or issues. Please like, subscribe, all that jazz. Until then, you can learn anything.